So you'll notice that if I take these trails and I go far enough, there's actually the first explosion that happens within my glass. And all this is two planes with smoke sprite sheets that I created within Houdini. You can see if I rotate around here that it's just two planes. And if you want to be able to like see it from all angles perfectly, like inside the glass, it's very hard to notice with just these two planes, so it looks fine. But if you were having this up closer, you may want to go for like 3 or 4 planes, or if you're doing a torch, that way if you're going around it, that you're not going to notice that it's just planes. But anyway, this is just these two smoke explosions that I rendered out of Houdini in sprite sheets, brought it in here, put it in this. And the reason I did that inside the same Niagara system is because I don't want any clipping issues. Since these are spawning pretty much at the exact same location where these two stones are hitting, which is the center of the sphere, if you remember, then I want to be able to say, hey, I want these light trails to always be visible, even if there's this smoke in front of it. So what you can do is you go to Sprite Renderer and you can set the sort order. And the sort order here, 2, and then this will be 0, 0. So this will always be in front of these explosions. The trails will always be in front of the explosions. And you have to set that up inside the same Niagara system. So now I'm going to show you how I created this smoke in Houdini and a bit about how I brought it into Unreal. So now I'm going to go through and talk about how I created my explosion. It's the first explosion that's contained within my glass that causes the glass to break a bit. And it's when the rocks hit. So you can see I have contained explosion. And then inside here I have a pyro burst source. I'll show you my settings. But basically all I'm doing is I'm creating a bunch of particles shooting out in every which way to represent how my explosion is going. And then I obviously have burn, temperature, and density created here. And then on the output attributes, I also added velocity noise. And then I rasterized my attributes. My density, temperature, burn, and velocity. I have some velocity blur. And then I just move that up a little bit because I want that to be kind of I want it to be where the rocks are actually hitting. And then inside my pyro solver, you can see this is red because this is the defaults for the shading when you haven't set up your pyro look. For the collisions, it doesn't actually have to be the glass that I'm going to use for the glass vat. So I just created a simple tube. I deleted the top and the bottom, and then I added a poly extrude. I moved it down a little bit, and then I did VDB from polygons because you have to have this via VDB if you want to use it for your collisions. And then I plugged that into my pyro solver. And this will, if I do it like this, I got file cache, it will, it's hitting the edges just like this. So I'm going to show you some of my settings inside my pyro solver. So box size 0.08, max substeps 2, sourcing, density, temperature, and I have pretty high disturbance on this because I don't want to get any weird kind of like bubble shapes. So I have a disturbance of 30, ton of disturbance. I'm just showing you my settings. Okay. So that's all I have here. And then inside my pyro look, you're probably wondering why it was, how I set it up. And it's actually very simple. Just my scatter, I turned this to blue. And I actually didn't create the purple with the pyro look. The pyro look is actually set up through lights. So how I did this is you see all these lights here at the bottom. Each of these lights has an intensity of 100. They're set to be purple. And they are just around here to give it kind of a purple edge because this is inside purple glass that is kind of glowing. So I wanted to create that edge along this explosion. And that's what you have here. And then to export this, you need to have a camera for each side that you want to export. So I can just go to colors contain front, boom. You can see these need to be the same size to avoid any stretching. And it'll export this whole explosion for 64 frames. So you can see here my settings. Contained front is the camera, put that there, and then the pyro look from the contained explosion. And then inside the export it to a folder, and you're going to take this folder and you're going to put it into your contents folder of your Unreal project. And then I did not actually use my motion vectors because I don't need them for this. But obviously I have my final color for the color, the emission, and MDC1, MDC2, and that'll just give us different lighting so that when we put in the light coordinates inside of Unreal, this will actually react to the lighting. So if we moved this explosion in our scene, it will react accordingly and we'll have correct lighting based on the lighting in our Unreal scene. So that's why you need these two. So, and then I did two of these. I did contain front and contain side. Because if you remember, I have two planes within my Unreal project in that Niagara system. So that means I don't want it to be the exact same. I could technically do this on each plane that's inside of Unreal, but then that's going to be really boring because if a player moved around this explosion or I'm getting a different angle, that's going to be the exact same explosion, just on another plane. I want it to actually look like as you rotate around, you're getting a different angle of the explosion. So I have this contain side, and you can do more of these to get different looks to add to detail, but for me I just needed two. So I have this one, that one, and then I obviously have my sun here if I need to change some of the lighting here. This is fine for now. So this is how I set that up, and then I'm going to show you how I brought in these textures in Unreal and how I set them up in that material. So now let's talk about how I set this up inside Unreal. If we go to the first person map and we go to the Side Effects Labs content plugin, if you go to materials, templates, they have the M template pyro advanced, and we're going to use this to set up our explosions. And if you don't have this, just check out the documentation, and it's also in my previous tutorial, the lightning one, on how to set this up. And we're just going to make some changes to this, and that's going to how we're going to set up our explosions. So let me go to the one that I have set up, which is in my Houdini explosions. Here we go. So the first change that I made to this is over here. I want to have direct control over the timing of this. I want to be able to slow down the end of the smoke, and I want to be able to speed up the beginning of it if I want to. So under dynamic parameters, I've set up my timing, plug that into this clamp here. That way I have direct control, and I'm going to set a curve inside of my Niagara emitter to set this up perfectly. Second thing I need to do is, if you notice when we're going around this, my explosions, as you go to the side of them, become opaque once you get to the side here. And that's all due to this logic right here. I'm using the camera vectors and this dot to set how opaque this is based on the camera vector. So if the camera vector is facing this right head on, then this is going to turn invisible. So for example, if I set this number to 0, this turn opacity to 0, I'll show you. Over here, turn opacity 0. I'm just going to do this so you can see. So now if I go to the side here, look at that. It looks weird. You could tell it's super, super flat. And then we don't want that. That looks bad. So what I did here is I need to set this to about 1.5. So, and the stronger this is, the less opaque it's going to be as you turn towards it. And to balance this out, because this makes the whole thing a bit opaque, is what you need to do, or what I've done is I came in here and I set up a second dynamic parameter, just OP for opacity, and then I increase that just a little bit. So to just go through my material instance first, turn opacity 1.5, I've turned off motion vectors because we're not using them. And then for world light position, you have to put the location of your light so that it's using the MDC1 and MDC2 textures correctly. So if I go to my scene here, you can see my directional light is at 920. So I put that setting inside my explosion so that it's getting correct lighting. And alpha curve here, just so if it's hitting anything, it'll fade it a bit. It'll fade out those edges. The emission, obviously, if you're gonna have, at the very beginning, I'm having it start a little bit brighter and then not. So the emissive scatter intensity starts, when this exactly starts, it's gonna be at an emission of 200, and then towards the end it's gonna go to 5. So we start really, really hot, and then we are not as emissive towards the end of it. And then this is where you put your textures once you've brought them into Unreal. You bring your emissive, final color texture, MDC1, MDC2 for the lighting, and that's it. Then you bring that into your Niagara system, and then you set it up. So you can see I have my dynamic material parameters. My OP is at 1.2, and the higher I set this, the more opaque it's going to be. I'll just show you. Get it, that looks really bad, but you get the point. Yep, so I'm going to set this to 1.2, back where it was. And then this is my timing. So I started off as, it gets to 0.5, and then we kind of even out as we get to 0.7. Last thing is setting up your alignment. Now by default, sprite render is always set to face camera, which means these guys would be always facing me as I rotated around them, but I don't want that. I want them to be obviously facing separate directions. So what you need to do is say custom alignment, custom facing vector, come into sprite facing and alignment, and change your settings here so that you have them facing the way you want them to. And you can change this. So if you're going to add more sprite sheets to this or different directions, you could just take this number and rotate it around and change it. And these obviously have different sprite facing and alignment. And then under initialize particles, if they're not perfectly lined up from the start at 0, 0, you can change these. So if like I was coming from the side here and I wanted to change it, I could move this one up a bit or this one down a bit in order to offset them. And that's it. Let's go. One last thing I should mention is that inside your master material, one thing you want to make sure is that your material is two-sided. That way when you rotate around your explosions that you'll be able to see the other side of it and it's not just going to be one side. Now that we've talked about the rocks racing into the air, we've talked about the spinning trails, that also includes that's the Niagara system that also has the explosion that happens that we just set up, and the rotation where the rocks get faster and faster and slowly come to a stop at the end. And next what we're going to talk about is we talked about the glowing lights that have the intensity going up. Now we'll talk about the stones shaking. You can see I have a timeline here. It goes up and down. This represents the stone's location. So they're going to be bouncing around all the time. And then at the end, what I'm having them do is I want them to be shaking differently. So I've multiplied one stone's relative location by -1. So they're shaking in opposite directions. I also set up their relative location to each other. So at 0, they're right on top of each other. So this represents when they're hitting. It only happens for like half a second. And then for the other times, they're moving away from each other. So at first they're a little bit away from each other. They hit. They get even further away from each other. They hit. They get even further away from each other. And they slowly get closer and closer until eventually they hit, causing the final explosion. After that, I have set up just deleting these components after they do that final hit because I don't want them staying around. Let's talk about how I did the lightning. So right now I just have 2 dynamic material instances that control the vat, and I'll show you how I set up that lightning inside of Houdini. If we go inside Houdini, you can see I have my exported glass here that I'm using. So there's my glass, and I'm going to use this to generate lightning around it. So I just have a lightning node. I'm just going to show you the settings. And I have about 50 arcs. It's not going to actually create that many. It'll do as many as it can based on the geometry that it finds. And I want it to spread pretty far. Beam thickness, columns, curve section length, noise. Everything else is default. And then after that, I'm basically just creating, I'm saving out all of this information over 100 frames. So you can think of it as it's looking at this mesh that's breaking apart and it's trying to create lightning on every single frame. It's trying to connect all those pieces, but it's not always going to be able to find pieces that works right. So it's just doing its best. And from that, you create kind of like lightning that's staticky and trying to move around and actually reacting to what's going on. And then for the second one, I combined it with a tube, and this tube is really simple. It's just moving apart and it kind of matches the glass breaking apart. To give it a bit more geometry, I want this piece of the lightning to be like all around the mesh top part. So this is like the bottom lightning and this is like the top part of the lightning. So I have a little bit different settings for this lightning. I want them to be a little bit different. So I have just 10 arcs, way more spread, because I don't mind if it wraps all the way around this tube. And then I'm actually changing this height from, and this last frame is, it's at 1.25. So it goes from 1.06 to 1.25 of the noise. That way it always looks like the lightning's moving. So even if sometimes the lightning mesh is exactly the same frame to frame, it'll always look like it's slowly growing or moving because that height in the noise is changing slightly. And then I just file cache this out, so it looks like this. And the only reason I'm exporting them separately is because I want to control them separately. So I want to control the speed of these a little bit differently. So once you're done with that, you put down a Labs Vertex Animation Texturing, set it to dynamic remeshing fluid, and you have to do a first pass and a second pass. You export those, it'll give you textures. I exported mine right into the contents folder of my Unreal project. And then all the other settings I've kept as default. It's going to give you 2 meshes and a bunch of textures, and you're going to use that inside Unreal to set up your vat. So let's go back into here and I'll show you my vat setup. So if we go here, this is my vat setup. And if you're confused about any of this, if you're like, what is vat dynamic remeshing, go to the Houdini documentation. You can find some great information on it in the ArtStation about setting up dynamic remeshing in the vat section. And all this is I'm plugging in my customized UVs, my world position offset, and my normals. And then this is just giving me a color value so that I can have like whatever color I want the lightning to glow. And then this is a noise that runs along our lightning. So I'll show you a good way to visualize that. Right now it's just stuck on frame 1, so it's not actually the animation. But if I go here, I turn on auto playback, I say save, and you can see, even though the lightning is moving now, but it looks like there's something going like across it, and that's from that noise, that kind of like jittery, not perfect material, because that noise is running across this with that panner. So I'm going to turn off that auto playback, just like that. Maybe I can set it to like 5. I'm just setting the frame of this. Like that is either. Anyway, so going back in here, this noise is running across that. There's a panner, which is set to 1 in the Y, so this texture is always moving across my lightning mesh as it's moving. So I have a moving mesh and a moving texture to create the effect. So then, so this is the same setup for the other one as well. So I'm just going to go into the material instance. In the material instance, you need to put your textures that you got out of Houdini, and I got my position, my rotation, and my lookup table. And I turn this off, and I turn on my display frame. And if we go back into the Stones BP, you can see I am setting up, okay, create a dynamic material instance, meaning I can control this, I can control the material from this blueprint. And then I'm saying set the game time, the first frame, set the visibility, turn it on, and then this is the most important part, this display frame. Display frame is basically like, okay, there's 100 frames or so, so this timeline is controlling. It's going. I went just to 90, but over 3 seconds, we're going all the way up to do the animation that we exported out of Houdini. And that's it. And then I'm just turning it off after that. And this is exactly the same thing. I'm creating a material instance for my vat, which is saying like, okay, let me control the vat from here. And then I'm saying, okay, I need to control the display frame. So I'm going in here, setting the display frame, have 100 frames over 3.5 seconds, and I want to kind of like ease it out so it maybe gets a little bit slower towards the end of its lifetime. And that's all there is to it. And then I'm turning it off their visibility at the end of this. So now let's talk about the end explosion, or the final explosion. So you can see I'm using my sphere here, which is in between my stones to set the location. And in here you can see it is set up exactly the same as my previous explosion, where it's just 2 planes, and they have the sprite sheets that we've created in Houdini. And on here you can see I have the custom facing vector, the sprite alignment, how long this explosion lasts for, the timing, the opacity. I do have the opacity a little bit different. Before I had it at 1.2, I believe, and now it's just at a 1. And I'll show you how I set that up in Houdini. It's going to be very similar to the last one, but let's go over it. So for this one, the thought process behind this is the final explosion. I wanted to combine the new Niagara fluids emitters, and I wanted to combine some Houdini stuff so that I have a Houdini sprite sheet for the high detail portion of this simulation. So the sprite sheet that we're making here is higher detail, and the smoke that interacts with the player along the ground is lower detail, but we'll combine them to create one cohesive explosion. You'll see more of that once I show you the Niagara emitter for the explosion, but for now, that should be enough. So I'm just going to show you my settings, initial size, spread angle 52, because I don't need it to be down here because we're going to use Niagara fluids for that. Burst animation, burst components, again, density, temperature, and burn, and exactly the same. Then have those, rasterize my attributes, just like the last one. Fireball, and I'll show you my settings. Come on, okay. So for this, voxel size 0.07, density, temperature, burn, We don't have any collisions on this because this is not colliding with the glass at all because it's part of the breaking glass. And for fields, this is my dissipation. And then for disturbance, again, I went with a 30. I want a very disturbed smoke here. Here's my turbulence. Shredding and flame expansion. And yeah, cache that out. And again, since we do not have the pyro look activated just yet, it's not actually taking effect. So if I go down here, there's my pyro look. That's what it looks like at the end. So then I'm doing exactly the same thing that I did before, where I have the highlights here for the bottom of the explosion, and let's turn this on. And then I am using this final explosion out to give us the front of this. Like this. Yep, just like this. And then I actually used the contained side camera for the other side as well. So I used it for two things. And make sure your smoke doesn't go out of bounds when you're setting up your camera here, or else you'll lose that in the sprite sheet. So yeah, that's all it is. Same thing. And then you just have your flipbooks. Exactly the same thing. I'm not using the motion vectors. I'm exporting all of this, and I'm doing two different sprite sheets, one for the front view and then one for side view. I did this side. Yeah. So then I'll have two sprite sheets, which is what you see inside of Unreal. And then, yeah, it works exactly the same way as the other explosion that I just showed you. And I have my emissive turned up at the beginning and not so much at the end. I can show you that. So I have my starting position at 50 and my ending at 5. So you have to play with these parameters to get a nice look depending on what you're going through, what you're going for. And obviously I have my MDC set up correctly. That's it. That's how I set up the explosion, or the final explosion, at least on the Houdini side. Now I'm going to talk about my purple smoke explosion. I'm sure there's a few questions about that. So it's just being activated inside the blueprint at the end of this timeline. So inside here, I just have smoke going off. And how I created this, the template that I used to start is I went out here, Niagara system, new system from template or behavior example. Make sure you have the Niagara fluids plugin installed. Next, and then you need to come down here and you need to go to the grid 3D simple particle source. So that's what I used to get started with this. And you need to change this to spawn burst instantaneous. I have 1,000. I have initialized particles between 0 and 2, uniform size 35, shape torus because I don't want a sphere. I want it all to come out from the ground. I added some velocity. I added a ton of velocity, some curl noise, and that's about it. And then to change the color, all I did was I came down here, and then in the M March smoke instance, I just changed the light color right here to a purple. I should also show you some of the settings that I have for this. So you can just see how I've messed with the density and the temperature. My vorticity confinement. I'm mainly doing a lot of trial and error to just try to find something that looks interesting. I should also mention that this, using the Niagara fluids, is very expensive. So please keep that in mind as you're working with this. It's not quite ready to be used in a big game, maybe something for like a cinematic or something, but you know, it's still in beta, so we'll see. Make sure you also have your user parameters and your like how big you want it to be able to be. This smoke can also collide with objects as long as you give it the right tag, but that's not necessary for what I'm doing here. I don't need to have collisions with much of the surrounding area since it's all just going outward. And yeah, that's how I set this up, and in conjunction with a Houdini simulation on top in the middle of this, you get a very interesting looking explosion.